The fact is that now the refusal to talk about them is what is problematic. There's a marker in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered that gets shot up every time they repair it. So they repair the memorial and people shoot it. And so to me, that Brian Stevenson and other people who keep repeating that action, I'm going to keep putting this marker here. I'm going to keep doing it because you can never have too much truth.
Just a little bit of background on the project. King Boston is an initiative to create a new memorial and programs centered on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King and their time and work together, which originated when they met here in Boston in the early 50s. Dr. King was in Boston as a student studying theology at Boston University, and he met Coretta Scott while she was studying music, as Renee just mentioned, at New England Conservatory. It's a part of our history, and our fairly recent history, that some know but many are surprised to learn. So many transplants visitors to the Boston area are not exposed to this legacy that our country's most prominent civil rights leader deepened his ideas and practice as an associate pastor at 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury. This is not a piece of American history most associated with the city of Boston, and it's something that as this project unfolds and people really learn about the connections between the Kings and the city is surprising and enriching. As I meet with people around the city, especially young artists of color, who are trying to make it here, this memorial to the Kings comes up in the context of representation around questions of whose story gets funded and told and how we can work together to challenge the dominant white narrative of Boston, one that's colonial, that's really core to Boston's culture and identity, but that doesn't always represent the full history and the full stories here. And a question that I hear all the time in the arts office and in other conversations happening around City Hall, around diversity, around racial equity, is what does it look like to represent our full and true story today, told by Indigenous and Black and Brown voices? So we find ourselves in a very challenging but ultimately exciting moment. It's a moment when we can lift up and celebrate the history of the Kings in Boston and where we can start to see and feel the narrative of Boston shifting. Memorial, obviously, at the end of the day, is an object. It can't necessarily solve all of these big systemic problems, but it can be a hugely important symbol and a catalyst in its own right, particularly when we think of the siting of this artwork in the historic Boston Common.
So as Cara mentioned, there have been 5 finalists chosen back in May as design teams to develop a memorial to Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King proposed for the Boston Common. But this evening is not a critique of the 5 individual designs, but rather we thought to convene a kind of broader conversation about the role of memorials in society today, what we want them to do for us, perhaps to inform the design process a little bit, but just really to help us all think more deeply about what we're calling the shifting landscape of public remembrance. We invest so much in our memorials. We want them to soothe our grief and assuage our guilt. And this past election reminds me, I was just thinking about this driving over here, can't believe it was already a week ago. This past election reminded me that the work of the Kings is very much still alive with us 50 years after his assassination. The voter suppression that was attempted and some possibly succeeded in Georgia, I think is just one example. And of course, we're also engaged in a very present movement to rethink and in some cases remove memorials to the Confederacy in the South that no longer represent American values and indeed never did. So my point is that it is not yesterday's news in any sense that we are memorializing the Kings and their continuing struggles. Meanwhile, on the Boston Common, the city's oldest public park, we have to consider the relationship between nature and structure. Some of these designs alter and transform the topography of the Common. And as Cara mentioned, the siting of this memorial coincides with a major master plan rethink of the entire 50 acres of the Boston Common that the city of Boston is engaged in coincidentally. So there's a lot to consider here. And do we have the panel to help us consider these things? As I said earlier, I can't go through all of their illustrious biographies, but I'm very quickly going to just introduce them for the record alphabetically. Sherry Fultonier is a practicing architect and Dean of Architecture and Design at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. Steve Locke is an artist and professor at Mass College of Art and Design.
We're going to fight.
Okay.
The two of us.
Yeah, good. Get
RISD
ready.
and Mass Art.
Well, we haven't introduced Max yet. You want to fight her? Max Page is a professor of architecture at UMass Amherst and an architectural historian. Ian Tabiner is a professor and director of the master's thesis at Boston Architectural College. And Mijin Yoon is professor of architecture at MIT and the incoming dean of architecture, art, and planning at Cornell. So thank you very much for being here. I want to begin by taking kind of a step back and generalizing with a simple but maybe profound question for all of you. And I think I'll start with Sherry, sort of alphabetically, and we'll just see how this conversation goes organically. The question is simply, what do we want our memorials to do for us in society? You know, basically, what is their purpose? Sherry, you want to get started?
Thanks.
Yeah. You can bring the microphone a little closer, maybe.
One correction, I am a landscape architect, not an architect.
Mm.
So I just wanted to start with that. That's
much the better.
A really big question, but I think the first thing I would say is given the time we live in, the question of we and who is we is really a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And one, I think it's really important not to try and simplify or begin by compressing into the assumption that whatever all of the we's want from a memorial, I doubt they're all going to be the same by any stretch of imagination, nor should they be. So there's sort of multiplicity of we's looking for the marking of meaning is something I think that we have the privilege of dealing with now and the complexity of dealing with, and I think it's one of the most interesting parts of discussing any monument or memorial at this time. So I know I'm skirting the answer a little bit, but I think that we now have set out into really new territory that's quite different than even 30 years ago in the way that we talked about memorialization.
Steve.
Well, for me, a memorial is a gesture in public space, and it's the notion of what is public is key to me, because I don't think that things that are to be memorialized are personal. I think that they are public things. And when a city or a municipality or a group of people decide to memorialize something in public, it's a statement of what they value. And it's a very clear statement that has scale, proportion. People dictate a certain amount of real estate or land to it. So it's a public acknowledgement of something that needs to be remembered. And I think the difficulty that we have is that we want, I'll speak for myself, I believe that artists can make objects that do a number of things, but I don't think that an artist can make an object that does everything. And I think that that is the challenge here. And I think about some of the greatest memorials. It's my mother calling me. Yeah. Ma, I'm on a panel right now. God. But I think the hardest thing is to, I think about some of the best memorials, and they have made something that seemed unbearable, present and bearable. And that's what I think. The act of memorialization is an act of marking loss. And no matter what we say about Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, they're both gone. And the notion that we would make an object for people who were gone means that we value something that they did, and that value has to be articulated through the built form. It can't be articulated through speech.
Yeah. You know, Max, that what Steve just said made me think about something I know you think about deeply, which is, you know, most of the memorials, certainly on the Boston Common, tend to be heroic, you know, the great man on the horse kind of thing. And yet, I know you've thought about how to memorialize our difficult history. I guess it's a matter of balance, you know, how to be true to the loss and to the pain that this memorial or any represents, while at the same time being somehow, I don't know, uplifting, or maybe we don't want to do that. Discuss.
Well, so let me just say, first, I just have to say, like, it was a great honor to serve on the editorial board with Renee Loth, who
Thank you.
transformed this journal into an outstanding journal. So I have to say that. So one thing I do want to say right off the bat, we're having this conversation in the midst of kind of a golden era of memorials. I mean, we have been building for the past, you know, I would say in some ways you can talk about post-World War II and the reaction to the Holocaust and the memorials there. We've been in this sort of age of memorial building. And I would say golden age, but you could also say there's something a little bit worrisome about that. When we feel the desperate need to memorialize often events, not this one in particular, but other events that are very in the recent past. I mean, on 9/12/2001, there was talk about what's the memorial to 9/11, and I just want to. I think that should be kind of the context a little bit for this discussion. What's the mania? I mean, there's good reason for every single memorial, but what's the mania, the fascination, the need that we have as a society for memorials? And I'll just say in relation to the question you just asked, one of my favorite books is Elaine Scarry's book on beauty and being just. And I always sort of think about the twin kind of directions in my own life, probably all of ours. It's like the quest for beauty, to see it, to make it, to share it, and then the quest to achieve some form, in whatever way you can, some form of justice in the world. And I guess what I would say is that memorials offer this allure that we can bring both of those together. You can encounter this incredible work of art and feel like, and we invested in this hope that it can help change the world. It can advance, it can restore or hold on to the memory of individuals who are very important, or make us confront something awful and therefore never have it happen again. And here's my caution, and I've gone through many years of worry or thought about this issue, and I want us to be wary about how much we invest in memorials to achieve the aims in society. I've become somewhat more skeptical, partly because I was fascinated with memorials to the Holocaust and to see the rise of Nazism, the rise of right-wing fascism, despite all the amazing memorials and all the ways we're trying to confront that. I just pose that as a worry for us when we invest, as all these memorial projects do, great hope about the impact of memorials on changing society.
Ian,
Yes, I think for maybe to.
you want to pull
answer-
the microphone
Oh,
right up to you.
sorry. To follow your comments, I think in an age of temporary media, memorials provide a permanent reference, and I think this is. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Right up there, yeah.
Is it working better now?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's better.
So in an age of temporary media, I think memorials can provide a permanent reference. And I think they can become places of healing and understanding. And for me, I find them most interesting when they blur public and private space, when it's neither public space or private space. And I think of Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where you can stand in the mall in a public space, but the space you looking at the memorial is a private space. The name carved in the stone is frozen, but every time that we return to the memorial, we have changed because we see our reflection in the memorial. So there's this dialogue of public and private, and I think also with her work, the ability to make other memorials from a memorial so that you can take something from. So in the making of a memorial, we should encounter it and we should leave that place, space, or object feeling different. But then maybe when we see it again, we would understand it differently. But also, in a case of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, you can take a rubbing. And I've been to many homes where I see the rubbing placed in glass in a prominent part in the home. So that this is a memorial that can make other memorials.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mijin.
I think we heard a lot of wonderful definitions of a memorial and its aspirations, and I think the notion that a memorial has aspirations is really critical. We heard that memorials are really representative, right? So they represent values, but they also, I think, enable civic engagement and participation and dialogue through the process. And I think we often forget that sometimes those processes are as powerful as the final physical memorial itself. And they enable those conversations, the kind of really difficult, challenging political conversations to happen because there's a third thing being discussed that enables you to have direct conversations about the first thing that is often challenging for communities to come together to discuss. And I think because they're aspirational, they put a stake in the ground about the future. So not only do they memorialize the past and a loss or something that was hidden and unearthed, but they also, I think, put a stake in the ground about our aspirations for our future.
Well, one of the things that's been inspiring about this process has been the many community meetings that were held. And just as you say, the conversations that, arose around the process of discussing the memorial, what do we want it to be, where do we want it to be, may be, well, certainly at least as important as the physical structure, the sculpture that we ultimately end up with. I'm wondering if there's any way, this is a difficult question, I know, but I'm wondering if there's any way to link those two, to sort of bridge that gap between the process and the community discussions that go into a process like this and the physical object itself, the structure itself. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, there are examples
Yeah,
of that.
tell.
I mean, I think so many memorials today are influenced by the whole debate about how we never forget in the Holocaust. And so there's some of the most creative ideas came out of there. And there's one in Harburg, right near Hamburg, in which it was a column, like the most classic idea of a memorial, in which people were encouraged to actually write their comments on it. And each year it went down a foot and ultimately disappeared into the ground. And the idea was that you can't rely on the memorial. You can't invest the memorial in the hopes for the society. It has to be through the dialogue. So it was like sort of embodying that idea.
Wow, that's good. Steve, you were nodding vigorously.
No, I was just I was thinking about that memorial in particular and thinking about Hoheisel and Nitz in particular, the notion of the anti-memorial, which is the place where I come from.
Explain more about that.
Well, the Hoheisel and Nitz, the project that affected me the most was the memorial to a memorial at Buchenwald, where there is a stainless steel plate in the ground at grade, heated to the temperature of a human body. And it's in the footprint of the original obelisk that the survivors of Buchenwald had erected, because that object was made of wood. It decayed, it fell apart. And, Hoheisel has the Ashcroft Fountain, the original proposal for Berlin, where his proposal to make a monument for the Jews murdered in Europe was to crush the Brandenburg Gate into gravel and spread it on the ground. Because this rash towards memorial building, which in my experience sort of exploded, that's a poor choice of words, but erupted after Oklahoma City with the rush to memorialize that tragedy and the participation of all sorts of people, like people who survived had a say in how the memorial was erected. And I began to think, well, you know, I'm old enough to think about surviving a tragedy as being your memorial, like your life is your memorial, you know? And so do we need to build memorials to living people? That becomes a question. Should we wait until all the survivors are dead before we start to make this public discussion? Do things happen to people or do they happen to nations? Like 11 September happened to people, but it also happened to the nation. So there's a way in which the personal has become a way of arguing for a voice in the creation of permanent form. I lost my loved one, so I have a say in how this memorial should be erected. Well, you know, you have a loved one, you have a funeral, you have a family, you have this sort of private idea of grief. Is that part of a public idea of grief? So these discussions about how communities get involved become very, very difficult because I'm not so sure whose life is more valuable than someone else's life when we talk about memorialization. And you saw this after 11 September with the special master deciding whose life was worth more money from the 9/11 fund. Well, you were just a busboy, so you get $250,000, but you worked for Cantor Fitzgerald, so you get $10 million. And so, like, how does that, I don't want to do that math. I certainly, and I think that math is disgusting, right? But when we're talking about memorializing things in public, when we're talking about things, not things that happen to people, but things that happen to the populace, not personal things, but things that happen in public, that we memorialize in public, that's a different discussion. And I think that it gets, when people start to decide, because I'm going to sound terrible when I say this, but not everyone knows anything about art. And so, thank you for laughing. Thank you for that. But there's always this, like, an artist will propose something, and then someone who's not an artist will come along and tell them how to make it better.
Yeah.
And I say, you know, well, if your plumber told you had to do this to fix your toilet, would you have a suggestion for your plumber about? No, because I know what I'm doing. Like, I'm an artist, I know what I'm doing. And one of the most beautiful things that Maya Lin ever said was when she said, because she knew who her client was when she was building the wall in Vietnam, she said, I knew a returning veteran would cry. That's how well she knew her client. And so that's the sort of relationship that the artist has with the form that they're building. They know what the artists know enough about form, because we can't think of anything outside of a form. Artists spend their whole life thinking about form and understanding what forms in public space will generate what kind of response. So the thing I love about this whole process is that people have trusted artists to come up with compelling forms.
So Sherry, as a landscape architect, let's talk about a little bit about the site and whether there is something particular about a memorial's placement in the land that can maybe bridge that gap between the community process or the conversations that and the dialogue that goes around a memorial and the object itself.
I'm going to take this in a slightly different
Go ahead.
direction. I think that I've become increasingly skeptical of the conflation of all types of memorials into a discussion of memorials. And I do that increasingly as I watch a couple of things happen with them. You know, the memorials like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the many of the Holocaust memorials, go back to the Lutyens Memorial for the World War I monuments that they are registering the loss of thousands and thousands of people who would otherwise not have been named under other conventional memorial processes and methods of those days. And that set in motion, I think, a desire of naming, but also a kind of erasure of the specificities and particularities of those who were lost. And I think that came about, I think, in response to just the shock of that many people dying at once under those circumstances, the need to mark and register their sacrifice. But I think that when there's a memorial being considered for a life of greatness, a singularity, a partnership like the Kings had, for instance, that to think that necessarily falls into what's become an increasingly formal language of memorialization, I have to question it. And I have to question this idea that there are strategies, either landscape or architectural or arts-based strategies that really can apply across the board to memorials, or that we would want to. I've been following, I think it was, I started paying attention to the effort to get a monument to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in New York a few years ago. And at that point started reading and then also doing a little research on representation of people in monumental or memorial statuary and who is represented and how. And it's pretty shocking who is not represented. So it's, I think there are questions that maybe don't immediately go to a space one can occupy in the process of remembering or marking or commemorating, but rather what is the necessity to actually represent those who have not been represented? And I especially think this is true of Coretta Scott King because there are almost zero representations of African American women in statuary in this country. I mean, Harriet Tubman, I believe there's a statue in Harlem of her.
There's one in the South End here.
Phyllis Wheatley.
And they are located in very specific places that are associated with communities of color. They are not in public spaces in a broader civic. And I have to question why we can't do that, or why that isn't part of the conversation. If 10%, the Smithsonian reckons about 10% of all statues in America in outdoor settings are of women. So you can just imagine how many of those are of women of color or other ethnicities. And there are not many more to men of color. So I find myself increasingly questioning the architecturalized or abstract language of memorials to people whose the specificity of their lives, of their gender, of their race is so entirely relevant to what happened and why we might, as a country, as a nation, as a people, want to remember them and mark in their presence in a lasting way that will transcend their lives and ours. So as a landscape architect, of course, I love seeing the landscape being involved in this, but in general, and I would, but I'm not sure that it's really an overarching goal. And then just memorials that are landscape expressions take a lot of space. And I raise that because in a public space like the Boston Common, when we live in a time when unprogrammed landscape space is increasingly rare, watching our public spaces where all sorts of things can happen by all sorts of people on a daily basis, as they become programmed and dedicated to specific memorials, as our parks increasingly are, I think that's something to question too. There are more compact and powerful ways to create memorials. I'm not trying to get landscape architects out of these equations, but I'm just, these are questions that I've
Well, it's so
been
interesting because
thinking
there's a
about.
couple of things there. One, I think the idea of a return to representation in the memorials as opposed to an abstract treatment is kind of going against the trend. I hate that word, but the trend has been toward more abstract, thinky memorials and less the statue kind of thing. So I think that's really interesting, and Oh, I had another thing to say about, Meejin and I were talking a little bit on the phone earlier about the idea of a distributed memorial, which is, something that doesn't take up quite as much space, but maybe is just equally powerful. And could you talk a little bit about that, Meejin, what you mean by that idea of the distributed memorial, or Max, or anybody who wants to
I
go in there?
think maybe we were discussing scale, and a question that often comes up when designing a memorial, which is what is the appropriate scale? How do you do an appropriately scaled monument or memorial to either a tragedy or an individual, etc.? And I think we were referring to the Stolpersteins, the stumbling block. Yeah. So the Stolpersteins are these simple blocks. They're stumbling blocks. It was also a derogatory term for Jewish people. And this memorial project started in one city and over time has grown and grown to multiple cities. And these blocks are placed in front of the house or the home of someone who was taken away during the Holocaust. And so for those who are conscious of these blocks, when they come across them, they're very powerful and meaningful. Some might just go about their everyday life without even noticing, but I think their kind of pervasive presence, and then the fact that other cities have also started to adopt this, has become another way of dealing with scale that maybe doesn't take up all physical space in one spot. But I think the kind of this appropriateness word that comes up when you are designing a memorial is fascinating, because there is no quantitative or qualitative measure of appropriateness. And I think the challenge for artists and designers is to somehow absorb all of the conversation and debate of a community, the aspiration of a city, and navigate that to create something meaningful. And I think memorials are fraught, and so I understand the kind of skepticism. Maybe I would like to believe there is still optimism in memorialization, but only if we continue to expand on ideas of what a memorial can be, both kind of physically and beyond physically. And I think that's what is pretty extraordinary about the Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King Memorial, that it had a physical component, but it has a kind of educational justice component as well, and understanding that those might not be able to be conflated in one structure. So understanding that education is as, if not more, powerful than maybe a physical form in one space might be.
Could I just jump in on this? Because there's a couple really interesting things you brought up. I mean, getting back to the question of process, you were saying, how do we hold on to the process? This famous line by Austrian writer Robert Musil, who said, "There's nothing in the world as invisible as a monument." And I think so much of what the memorial culture, and the best part of it, is to say, how do we make this so that it doesn't disappear and become a place where you just drop a wreath on Memorial Day, on Veterans Day, and just disappear. And the Stolperstein is part of that, was the idea that it's going to be dispersed and you are going to not know when you're going to encounter them. So that you're going to have not thought about the Holocaust walking around Berlin, and you're living your life in this burgeoning European city, and then you'll literally stumble across them and have to think again. I think that was the kind of the power of that idea. But I just wanted to pick up on this question of, I'm glad you brought up that this project has many other components, but we talk about this as the memorial. And I guess I teach architecture. I love architecture. I love these memorials in a lot of ways. And yet I think about like the War Memorial in my town, and I live in Western Mass, And the War Memorial is, I mean, there's a flag and there's a little tiny plaque. It's like the War Memorial for all wars, well, all the wars that they got to at that point when they built it. But the War Memorial was the pool. It's called the War Memorial Pool. The pool and all those kids, and I grew up and my kids grew up going there, that's the memorial. And I feel like that is something we understand, and yet I feel like we've sort of veered away from that. Most of the big gargantuan, I would argue in some cases, memorials that we've built are memorials as memorials, and that experience of them is supposed to be the full extent of it. And you're supposed to have such a powerful encounter, or the society supposed to learn so much that that's all that needs to be there. And yet we have this older ideal where the memorial is an investment in our institutions and universities and libraries and pools and so on. And I wonder whether, and this is trying to do that in a way, and yet we're still just talking about the building. So I just think that's a powerful idea that we should
I
kind of
appreciate
reclaim.
that you said that, and that people should understand that the entire project includes a grant for the 12th Baptist Church, 10th, 12th, yeah, yeah, Baptist Church to do programming, and there'll be educational programming associated with this. So it's important to that there's a sort of living memorial aspect to it. It's not just a sculpture, which it does. I mean, just through familiarity can get lost sometimes. Anybody can just dive in right now and talk some more about the challenge of representation, the abstract versus representational, anything.
I'd like to talk about the challenge of representation.
ahead.
Right. And I don't see a difference between abstraction and reality. There's no difference between the two. Like a real form, an abstract form is just as real as any other form. It's physical. It's a raw physical fact. I think that this notion of representation, and particularly representation of blackness in public, is part of the problem here. There are lots of memorials to Dr. King all over the place. And there's lots of really bad sculptures of Dr. King.
There's one in Washington.
There's a terrible one in Washington, made of white marble. That's
Yeah.
not lost on me.
Yeah.
No, seriously, that's not lost on me. Like, marble comes in black.
Yeah.
John Wilson should have had that commission. John Wilson was one of the greatest artists who ever lived. He made the bust of King that is in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. That is when we look at the image of King, we think of John Wilson's imagery. That's how powerful and connected his imagery is. Picasso made a painting of Gertrude Stein, and Stein said to him, "Pablo, I don't look like that." And he said, "You will." Right. Because the artist has made the image that has
Yes.
become the image
Yeah.
of the person, right?
Right.
And that's complete abstraction. That is abstraction at its finest, right? Now, there is a long history of black objects that are supposed to be people, right? They're called Black Americana figurines. They are all over the place. They are all over this country. Blackness and abstraction is the American gesture. How can you look at one of those little black things and assume that that is human? That is abstraction at its core. And that's distinctly American, that kind of abstraction. So when we're talking about representing people through imagery and through the form, sculpture is one way to do it. But this notion that there is a definitive way to represent the human subject is the thing that's problematic for me. Because the notion that maybe a color makes you think of a person, maybe a shape makes you think of a person. So this notion that a sculpture is this thing that is sort of plopped down, and then the real memory happens somewhere else, right? I think about the AIDS Memorial in Provincetown, which is a piece of the ocean taken out of the ocean, made literal, and put into the city, put into the town of Provincetown. And so that notion, that gesture of taking something that is eternal, formalizing it, and putting it in public space, that's the activity. And I think that, I'm sorry, I just kicked you. I'm sorry. Oh, God. I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying about, there are 4 monuments to women in this town, right? One of them is Phyllis Wheatley.
Right.
The other one's Harriet Tubman, right? And then there's Lucy Stone, Abigail Adams, Mary Dyer,
Right, very
and
dire.
Ann Hutchinson.
Right.
And Stone, Wheatley, and Adams have to share a monument, right? They all get together, and that's the women's monument, right? And so that is, to me, that is obscene. That's the gesture. That's obscene, you know. And so the notion, like, who gets remembered. The question isn't whether or not we should remember things. The question is what gets remembered.
Sure.
Now, like a King Memorial, now, in 2000, now. Okay, so that becomes super interesting to me. Why him and why now? Well, all these other things that we could memorialize. Why are we memorializing King now, right? And like, I don't have the answer to that question, but I do think that there's other things that we could memorialize. There are other things that we could talk about, but we're talking about this now. And look at the people in the room. Right, so we're talking about a memorial that makes a certain group of people comfortable with a certain kind of idea of blackness. And that, you know, like, I'm fine with that. Dr. King belongs to everybody.
Right.
And this notion that blackness could belong to everybody is the thing that I'm really excited about this memorial, that people could look at that memorial that is about blackness and see themselves in it, independent of from whence they come. And that, to me, is the real working of memorial space to talk about King's actual legacy. Not color blindness, but the presence of color in all of us, right? So this notion
Yeah.
between abstraction and realism and all that sort of stuff, that's a not a real binary.
Academic, yeah.
Yeah.
Others? Max?
Sorry, I just want to jump into this
Can't
because
help.
you.
Max
but see, when-
loves to jump in. Jump in, Max.
I don't want. I mean, just because you brought up the question of why this and why now, so I just have to like raise the question of who's paying for this, and let's just ask ourselves about that question. And I don't have actually a definitive answer to that, but this is launched by, and I think we heard about the generosity of an individual, a multimillionaire, and I just think we should ask about that question in our society in general, how we have started increasingly to look to the very wealthy, who have become more wealthy than ever, not only to be the patrons of the arts, but also to solve our problems, right? Whether to solve, you know, what's his name from Facebook wants to, you know, solve the schooling problem. So he just took over the Newark public schools. So I just think, I wanted to think about that. Like on the one hand, you could say, what's the problem? There's money, then there's a process. We're all thinking about it. We have great architects working on this. What's the problem if the money comes from one place? But I guess I was spurred to talk because you said, like, what is the image that being projected? And can one separate out the kind of slice, the kind of way of understanding Dr. King and Coretta Scott King from the source?
Right.
In other words, like I love a lot of the wording here, and I know we're not critiquing individuals, but the words that come across, you know, that I saw at the end, you know, inspire visitors, powerful cognitive force, fellowship, community, justice. There's a lot of very optimistic words, and yet a lot of at the end of his life, especially, were quite harsh critiques
Right.
about the economic injustice. And I wonder how we square fighting economic injustice when you have. As Gilda Radner said, if you have $1 million, you stole it from someone, right? I think she said that. Was someone else who said that? Right. So, so the question is, like, how do you square those things? And I just think we got to lay that on the table because we have far too many very wealthy people who then have been emboldened, and maybe we even invited them to decide how to direct both our city design and also the way our institutions, like our schools, run.
Spoken by the new Vice President of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. Yeah, I couldn't help it. Okay, anybody else want to?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because I think it goes back to what do we want out of memorials, and I think we want too much. The question of specificity, the Kings were here at a time in their lives, a time that Martin Luther King devoted very much to study, worked very hard. That's what he did in Boston. Is that what we're aiming at?
Right.
I mean, that's the question that comes to me. If it's in a location that's central to public space in Boston, is that what we want to look at? And that's a message in and of itself, and a message related to a school, a message related to ongoing learning, to equity, to application of learning what you need to know to go forth and do what you're going to do in your life. When it starts then getting into the bigger, we're going to share all of the all of the legacy of the kings. I would argue that it becomes a lost opportunity to anchor it in a meaningful way in this time and place and in a specific developmental part of this process of service to a greater cause.
We're going to, in a few minutes, we're going to go to questions questions from the audience. And nobody asked me to do this, but I'm just thinking, are there any recommendations that you each have for the committee, for the city as we continue to go down this road? That's a trick question. I'm springing on you. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Well, one of the things,
Yeah,
excuse me,
Ian.
I always forget about this microphone. One of the things that I came across, I didn't enter this competition, but I was interested and I wanted to do research. So I had read, of course, and listened to the speeches of Dr. King, but in an unusual place, I came across this ideas, and it was an essay written by John Cage. An essay's called "The Future of Music," and in the essay, he speaks about the importance of Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, and how this was central to Dr. King and to Gandhi and to the King of Denmark when the Gestapo should come in. And for me, when I read that, it really grounded the fact that the Kings were in Boston and that they met here, and that Dr. King had gone to school at Boston University, I assume getting his PhD, and then also being a pastor at a church in Dorchester or Roxbury. So there, and then also reading this great early American writer that was there. For me, I also struggled with the site, but then I read that Dr. King had led a march from Roxbury Playground to the Boston Common. So then I wondered, is it the same part of the Boston Common where the memorial is proposed, or is it not? I don't know. But I found these connections very, very interesting to me. And I would leave it at that. The other thing I think is that with memorials, their siting is critical. When there is a site where the event has happened, and in my case, my experience was working on the memorial at Kent State University. The students had been shot within 20, 30 feet of where the memorial was proposed, but it wasn't exactly the right spot. In other places, Maya Lin does this fantastic memorial in Washington, but it's not in Vietnam. But the veterans couldn't go to Vietnam, so then they needed a place to come together. So the idea of siting and where it is, for me, my memory of being early high school student and watching the marches on television in Canada, Dr. King for me, is about procession and movement, right? These marches, and they were peaceful. And for me, that would be the way I would think that I might memorialize him. That and maybe there, as you had proposed, smaller memorials, there's places along the way that we move. There's about movement. And hopefully this movement and procession as a people and society is to a better place and a better understanding, so that when we walk together, we look on either side of us and we see someone who maybe their skin is not the same as us, or they come from a different background, but we're doing the same thing and we're together. Thank you.
Which one? This one's mine. I just want to agree wholeheartedly with my colleague here. To me, this is about two people falling in love and developing their lives together and forming a bond that enabled them to fight the most pernicious system of injustice in this country. So that notion of two people coming together, and this city made that possible. And so I think that the whole legacy of Dr. King is incredibly complicated and complex, right? And if we're going to take that on, that's like a whole other thing. But what we're talking about here is two young people who do not know that they are going to become Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. They do not know that that is what they are going to become. They're two people in the Athens of America, right? Doing their studying, becoming and creating this sort of, that marriage, like, she could have done anything after he died. I mean, she could have had a talk show. Like, she could have done any crazy-ass thing after he died, right? But she didn't, because that marriage seemed to continue, right? And so that, to me, is what, when I saw the RFI to do this, I thought, I couldn't do it because I couldn't build that form. I don't understand what that form is of the crucible that brought those two people together, that gave them enough power, or whatever it is, to be able to become who they were. And so if I had a message to the committee, it would be to remember that this is a monument to love. Like, it's a monument to the kind of love that actually changed the face of this planet. And that everything else, in my mind, is secondary to that. But this city gave them the ability to find each other in that way.
Others, last words? Meejin? Not last, but
No, that was beautiful.
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sherry? Max? Go ahead.
All right, Steven Snyers. I'll just say one thing, because I think that was quite beautiful indeed. I guess you were asking for recommendations. The only recommendations I would say is like to stop and reconsider, not just location, but the concept. At least to reconsider it, to take a whole different tack, because when you say it's about love, it's also about ideas, or like, or beauty, in the sense of like he's exploring theological ideas. There's obviously there's an aesthetic power as well as religious power to that, and then she is studying music. Like, why wouldn't it be somewhere located there? How do we, as you said, the Athens of America? This is as much about being drawn to a place where they thought there were ideas to be found and made. So I don't know. That's a recommendation. Just like, I understand the power of saying, actually, it's important for this life to be, and these lives to occupy one of our sacred spaces, one of our most sacred spaces,
Right.
the Boston Common. But maybe there's a better way, a distributed way, to get at this that is a little more humble, but perhaps more powerful ultimately.
Well, you can see how complicated this is for the for the city and for the committee. I'm not envious, but I'm respectful of this process. So I'm going to open it up now to questions. Alice? Oh, we have to, I'm losing the microphone, okay. Remember, these are being recorded for posterity.
Watch your language, in other words.
Do I have to introduce myself for posterity? My name is Alice, and I have a question about the Boston Public Library. So that's a space that technically the facade is not designed to be a memorial, but Sherry, when you distinguished between all the many people being named versus the individuals, the thing that I love and struggle with on the library is the way they've used the names of all those people to say there's a diversity of ideas inside. And this is something I talk about when I give tours of the library. There's so many different kinds of ideas represented there, but the actual people themselves are nearly all men, and they're nearly all European or Americans of European descent. And I wonder how the city can talk about that. I don't know, it's not exactly a memorial, but how can we reimagine what diversity of ideas looks like in the 21st century and address this really strikingly beautiful, but feeling now very historic object?
I made a project about the library recently, and it was called Love Letter to a Library. where I had these banners fabricated to go on the front of the McKim building, and now they're traveling to different libraries around the city. Anyone in Fields Corner? No? At Fields Corner, there'll be a banner that says, "I remember everything you taught me here," on the facade of the library, right? This is the thing about Western culture. It doesn't just belong to white people. And so that notion of looking at the library and somehow not being included because I'm not white is, it's one of the pernicious lies of racism. Like, that library belongs to me. And that is the thing, it says free to all on the front, right? It doesn't say free to all the Western white European people, it says free to all. And this is the thing that we have to do. We have to, if that's what you say, I can't go by what you say, I have to go by what you do, right? So I'm gonna come into this library and I'm gonna claim it as my own space. And this is what the problem with No Child Left Behind and all these ways that we have undereducated people. We have told people that this belongs to white men, and this belongs to women, and this belongs to queer people, and this belongs to black people. And if there are white people here, then you're not welcome, right? And the truth of the matter is that it takes a tremendous act of courage to be a woman in this world. Every day you wake up as a woman, it's a tremendous act of courage to leave your house, to park your car, to do all these sorts of things, right? I celebrate that, right? And in order to celebrate that, I have to make sure that women have access to all the same spaces I have as a man. That's my job to do that. And it's my job to make sure that young people have access to spaces that I felt like I had access to that they don't feel like they have access to. That's why I put the banners on the front of the library, because I want everyone to be able to remember there. And that's why they started to go to the branch libraries. Because you know where the first branch library was? Mattapan. It's the first branch library, right? And people in Mattapan know that. And they love their library. They love that place, right? And so that notion that somehow the McKim building is for one group of people and the Mattapan library is for another group of people is completely exploded by that. Because the Mattapan library and the McKim building, they're the same place. And so I think that this is the struggle, right? When we tell people that these are white institutions or that they are conscripted into this role of reproducing whiteness, it's white people's job to step in and say, no, you're welcome here, right?
I'd like to add to that. As an educator in an art and design school who daily deals with students who have no patience for the fact that that is a practice that could easily be perpetuated and who demand representation now, and overt representation, not this sort of a lot of names, but we don't know who belongs to what. They want it and they want it now, and I think they're right. And I think that there is tremendous responsibility to acknowledge that these buildings came from a historical moment when this happened, but that everything going forth here, what is exhibited inside, what is added, has to change. And it has to accommodate representation of all of us.
Right.
And the more we shirk that out of protection for an aesthetic, for a historical process, all we're doing is delaying something that really needs to happen. And it's, and I think I do want to add something to the, not advice, but just an appreciation for this monument, this memorial, this school, this however you want to think of this way of marking the lives of Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King. I think it's marvelous that there's been a decision not to make it a Martin Luther King memorial solely.
Right.
I think it is a wonderful, wonderful step. Do I think it's getting there yet? No. But I think that this acknowledgement that the complexity of a life lived with a partner is an extraordinary movement forward for a memorial. And so, you know, I would just advocate for going further into that. And one last thing, I was so moved by the outpouring of response to the portrait of Michelle Obama.
Mhm.
And the idea that there's a representation there for so many girls that has never been there. And how important that is. It's been part of what's motivated my sort of return to looking at sculptural representation, which I think is not a binary. I think there's an extraordinary gradient of abstraction and range of creativity in capturing likeness and in representation. But there's such a body of work now that really does establish the grounds for how necessary it is. And, you know, not to be flippant, but probably many of those white men who are represented in our August buildings were queer. I mean, we just didn't know it.
Right.
So they're
Right.
hidden.
They didn't have that word or
Right.
whatever. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
there are hidden diversities there. But you know, we've moved into a realm where I think the overt representation, the claiming that goes along with that is both necessary and healing.
One of the things, it's sort of my opinion about what would be important about a memorial is a lot of the points you've made I agree with completely. There's different we's, there's abstracts, there's reality, there's where it's placed. But I say a monument is one of the important elements of remembering is the education that goes along with it. So we talked about some grant programs and there'll be some educational programs. But I'm thinking about the permanent education in words that are there on the site. Because art is interpretive. And yes, the artist might have known what he or she was doing. But there are a lot of people that don't understand it. And we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years, a lot of monuments that have been misunderstood, a lot of debate. And it's really, I think, because there wasn't a lot of attention paid to the messaging associated with that. It could be as simply as what the plaque says. So it's misinterpreted. And I have actually some personal experience with a statue that was removed. I really didn't really know about it until this summer. But and it was just because of a misinterpretation of the artist, maybe 150 years after that statue was done. Didn't realize how we were going to look at it today. And it was really could have been solved if just the messaging had been clear. So there begins maybe a part of the solution is some of this misinterpretation is making sure they get the message right. Maybe it reflects several we's, that messaging. But that's very important, I think.
Point in my head about the difference between an event and an individual and the importance of acknowledging an event and acknowledging an individual. And I think rather than conflate the two, you know, thinking about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, thinking about the Montgomery Peace and Justice, and, you know, the ways that has gotten about, but now thinking about Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King and what you said about that march from Roxbury to the Boston Common, should not the acknowledgement be an acknowledgement of that march? And so therefore it doesn't take place in one, or is not captured in one site only, but rather is captured in part, you know, connecting parts of the city, which metaphorically as well as realistically should goddamn well happen, even now, and especially now. And so to think about what would that look like, and what would that evoke, and in fact, what would that catalyze in the way of the person, you know, on the part of the person who is looking at it, walking it, experiencing it. You know, it doesn't have to be articulated, you know, subject, verb, object, but just what is a trigger? And trying to make sure that something that is developed just triggers. You don't know what it's going to trigger, and in a way it doesn't matter, as long as it triggers something.
What is interesting to me is that the march was about housing and lack of housing and a lack of affordable housing. And actually,
Glad we solved that problem.
and we can still march and talk about those things today, right? And we can still march and talk about those things today.
When Abraham Lincoln you know, he was sort of the motivating force behind Memorial Day, and he was thinking forward about how to bring the two sides together. And what you said reminds me that in a lot of memorial, there's a practice, a ritual involved, where a marking that you participate in. And I think one of the best Boston memorials is actually the Memorial Day one on the Common with all of the flags. And I'm always surprised when I see it. I'm always completely sort of moved and captivated at those little flags and how many of them are, that they're not there all the time. And so it sort of every time makes me remember freshly and in a really different way. So, you know, I think that that's something that has been lost to a certain extent, that the ritual of approaching experience a monument or a memorial has become very individualized, but that these sort of collective processes that could be considered, it's an interesting thing to inject back into this conversation.
I was wondering if one or some of you could speak to memorial's role in reframing or retelling history and sort of creating new truths, either, you know, sometimes maliciously, as in the case of a lot of the Civil War Confederate statues erected during Jim Crow, and sometimes unintentionally, like the Picasso reference earlier, how memorials start to create a new truth or a different truth, and how we can address that both in the design and consumption of memorials.
I mean, just, you know, in terms of, since you brought up the Confederate memorials, I mean, that was not alone, but they, as part of a larger project, completely nullified what the war could have been about, the Civil War could have been about, and participated in creating a whole story that then included also a resubjugation of formerly enslaved people. So it was quite powerful in that. I just actually, someone was talking about the inscriptions or how you tell the story, and some of those, you know, there's one that was torn down, and one of the first ones that was taken down in New Orleans, says, in case people think that white supremacy is a phrase we use today, it says this is a monument from 1890, a monument to white supremacy. Actually, so it's quite clear exactly what the purpose was there. Interestingly, I mean, just the one, as soon as you asked that question, I know Mass Design is involved in one of these projects. I mean, I think the Montgomery Memorial is trying to reclaim a history or tell a fuller tale of a history that hasn't been told. And I actually think that's one of those examples of kind of the dispersed memorial idea, because the idea is that, not that it would completely disappear, but large parts of that memorial would go back to the towns if they were willing to acknowledge their history. And if all the small towns where there were lynchings that occurred were actually willing to put up a monument there, that could begin. I mean, now I'm being optimistic about what memorials can do, but it could start that, you know, the domino effect of people saying, what's that? This happened here? And start to ask those questions. That's where the memorials can be very powerful.
Maybe I could just share a little bit. I'm working with colleagues on a memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA, and it's a project in which I've developed an enormous respect for historians who are very conscious that words are actually also fraught and interpretation is fraught. And so even the term slave is very different from enslaved, right? An act on another human being versus a noun, let's say. And so the UVA Memorial, what's extraordinary about that project was it was actually an undergraduate thesis, relatively in recent years, that uncovered a different history than the one that she had been told, or was commonly told, let's say, on the grounds and on campus. That led to us kind of a student group to bring forward this notion to the university and launched a committee of scholars that really looked into the archive. And so a prior narrative of a number of enslaved people at UVA went from a very small number to up to 5,000, right? And revealing that story and communicating the magnitude of a kind of history that was hidden, kind of hidden in plain sight through narrative, through interpretation, and even in writing, I think is another important activity of memorialization, to right those past wrongs in some manner.
Sam, I think that you can never have too much truth. Like that's the bottom line, is that there's always more truth. It's like this first young woman who raised the question: when you have women, when you have black people, and when you have people of color involved in these decisions, then those questions get asked. The fact that there's a woman in the library leads someone to ask the question, how come there are no women on the front of the library? Like that notion, and that becomes this sort of excavation of more and more truth. And I just want to say that these stories are not unknown. They are not unknown. They are known. The lynchings are known, and they're known throughout the South. That was the purpose of having them, so that they would be known. The fact is that now the refusal to talk about them is what is problematic. There's a marker in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered, that gets shot up every time they repair it. So they repair the memorial and people shoot it. And so to me, Brian Stevenson and other people who keep repeating that action, I'm going to keep putting this marker here. I'm going to keep doing it, because you can never have too much truth. And like the more truth you have, the more backlash there's going to be against it.
Given that the American cities are far more dense and getting denser and denser, it seems logical that the physical space to have the chance to have proportionality of memorials in terms of race and gender is ever more a challenge. So do you see, we'll never have any more giant monuments like Lincoln or Jefferson, that gigantic scale. So how do you see creatively, can we achieve racial, gender, etc., proportionality to the degree that a kid 20 years from now, 30 years from now, walks through a city and feels they are represented? Or do you see challenges in the density and lack of space in parks and whatnot? How do you get around that?
Well, I think the monumentality should be questioned. There was already a critique of the monumental. It started in around the 1920s of, why do we need big statues? Why do we need big monuments? And that has waxed and waned. But if we're talking about a multiplicity of representation and memorialization, maybe we should be questioning why they have to be so big. And I think sometimes they have to be so big because of the constituents that advocate for them, because they're expressing something more than the memory. They're also expressing a specific group's ability to mobilize funds and political will to build it. Right. I think the World War II Memorial in Washington is a really good example of that. But there are countless other ways of representing and memorializing. And I think as you go across the country, I've seen some remarkable impromptu and informal memorials to loss, to heroic action, to group actions or protests that are not always permanent. Sometimes they're maintained, as I think the memorial becomes actually the action of maintaining, repairing, restoring that marker. So there's, I think you ask a really good question, and it's a question that I think cities could be asking themselves about monumentality.
Can I just add to that? There's two ways, and you brought it up about the temporary memorials. Many of you know the Jewish tradition of putting a stone on a marker. That goes back to the notion that you're supposed to just simply gather some stones together to mark, and you need to come back because the stones will fall and you need to pull it together. So now we have these permanent gravestones, and you put a stone on to reenact that notion of coming back each year. So there's something very powerful about it. When we think of the 9/11 Memorial, this gargantuan $20 billion endeavor, but for many, the most powerful thing is what happens for a few weeks when they shine those the Twin Towers in the sky. One other idea, just a thought, and maybe I wonder what the artists will react to this, is thinking about rather than additive, like one of our reactions is, and understandably, rightly, like we need to give representation to people who've been left out, and they need to occupy space. There's logic to that. But what about representing and and engaging with existing memorials? Like there's a Lincoln Memorial, right? A very controversial, problematic memorial right off the common. What if this were involved in a dialogue with that? Now, that may undermine that artist's intent, but there's something powerful about saying we're going to be in a dialogue with these because these memorials mean things differently over time. So why don't we bring our artists of today into dialogue with memorials of the past?
I kind of love the Emancipation Group. I love that thing. I saw the original in Washington. That's one of the first memorials. Freed slaves paid for that. They contributed, and they hired the sculptor, and they chose the image that they wanted to make for themselves. Now, we understand that memorial completely differently now. And the one that is in Park Square is a copy of the original. And so we understand it differently. We think it's about oppression, and it makes black people look foolish and blind and stupid and all this sort of stuff, which, Saul LeWitt tells us that the art of the past is understood with the conventions of the present, thereby misunderstanding the art of the past, right? And so like that sort of notion that those people were trying to make a fool of us is deeply problematic. But I say to my students all the time, my favorite movie growing up was Blazing Saddles. You could not make that movie today. You could not make that movie. And Derek, who asked that wonderful question, I think I would love to have a little white kid walk through a landscape and see a sculpture of Barack Obama and aspire to be that, right? So this notion that I believe that the more representation, the better. Like more, not less, more. And like the question of space is always going to be with us. Like who gets space? That's really the question. It's not a question of having enough or not having enough. It's the question of who gets it. And that, to me, when we talk about scale and monumentality and proportionality, you think about some of the smaller interventions in public space that black and brown people have made in order to reframe the experience of walking in the South, right? Like Toni Morrison says, there is not a place where you or I can go to think about or to not think about the lives of slaves. There's not even a bench by the road, right? And so that notion that throughout the history of this country, there has been no space set aside for that. And so the notion that in response to that, we would want to claim a huge amount of space, no. We don't have to claim a huge amount of space to talk about a gigantic loss. Like when you walk through the Commonwealth Mall, those little bronze plaques that memorialize like people like David Brednoy and stuff like that, those are incredibly powerful. And I think that the concentration of that kind of gesture is just as powerful as some sort of gigantic edifice that can be erected.
Good evening. This has been a real treat, and thank you. It's been really a rich conversation. Actually, I've just been brought on about 3 weeks ago as the new ED for King Boston, and sitting with me is co-chair of the advisory committee, Liz Walker. And I want to say, as I walk into this room, I want to tell you this. In 2017, I grew up in Upham's Corner in Boston, so I can't take it from the perspective of this august panel. I'll tell you from a little girl who grew up in Upham's Corner and who used to walk from Dudley to Roxbury, St. Patrick's every day to go to school, and then who had occasion every once in a while to go to downtown Boston and into the Commons, right? Because it wasn't a place where, if you were from Upham's Corner, that you would really have a need to visit unless your school was taking you on a trip to visit the Freedom Trail. There wasn't any real need for me to be there. And even as an adult, in terms of representation, now I get the real treat of being able to be part of the reading of the Frederick Douglass's speech every year and visiting the Shaw Memorial and all that. That's great. What I thought was really what pulled me to be part of this when I was asked was the opportunity it presented to the city of Boston that I grew up in. Because this is a city, I grew up during busing. And there's a history here, whether we care to talk about it or not. And there's an opportunity that's been presented to us. And what I liked about the opportunity presented was the fact that the gentleman who asked if he could help went to the community and asked the community who was closest to it, right? The experience of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, what would they like? That's a unique experience for me, growing up in Upham's Corner, to have had that question asked, and actually went over because my friend here, Liz, invited me to come over to the church and listen to the gentleman. So it wasn't anything that was imposed on a community. See, for years I'd been asked, wouldn't it be nice to have a Martin Luther King memorial? But no one came up with the money. And unfortunately, the community that I come from really didn't have the resources to be able to do that. And so while I enjoy the Bill Russell statue that's on City Hall Plaza, that's one aspect of what it is to be black in Boston. We're richer than that. And I think that what I loved about the fact that we chose Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, it has layers of representation. It represented the spirit and the struggles of folks of African descent in this country for me. It does that. And it showed that I had a place. In 1634, whenever the Commons was dedicated, there were black people around, but we didn't get a chance to have a voice in how it was developed. So no, we weren't there on the Commons. In the 1880s and the 1800s, we were there too. But there wasn't anyone asking us how we felt and whether or not we wanted to be represented. And here it comes. Yes, it came from a gentleman who's affluent, but we're grateful that he asked us what we thought and asked us for our opinion. And it was a collective thing. It wasn't one person. I think over 1,800 people submitted their thoughts on what it could be. And from that process, renderings emerged. And from that process, there'll be an opportunity for more input from everyone throughout this great city of ours. And it can be whatever you want it to be for you, you know, based in, because it's going to be that collective. Because Dr. King was that global person. So yeah, it is about the struggle. It is about the love. And for me, to be able to have on the Boston Commons a representation of an African-American couple, a unit, because we're always talked about how the dysfunctionality of African-American families. They weren't dysfunctional. They showed us love. They showed us what love could be and how it could transform not just a city, but a country. And as a result of that, I am blessed to have had many of the privileges that I enjoy, whether it's going to school in desegregated North, whether it's going to college. But that love allowed for all of that to happen. And when he died, he was talking about the very things we're talking about today. And she was right in there with him. So for the city of Boston, that city on a hill, to be able to celebrate that legacy, for you to find a space to reflect upon whatever aspect of that legacy makes you feel whole, I think is a beautiful thing. And as I have children today, and as I will have grandchildren in this city, they will be able to see themselves reflected, because it's not about me right now. It is really about who we are as a city and where we're going. And this is a transformational experience for us to talk about Boston as one that celebrates everybody. And there'll be an opportunity for us, all of us, to own a piece of the common and see ourselves as free people on the commons, because the Kings have allowed us to do that. So I do hope you will continue to be in the conversation with us, because it's an important one for us to have, and it is important for all of us to see ourselves reflected. And, you know, Kings dream of the beloved community. So I was very, very happy to be here this evening. Thank you, Renee.